Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the grand final of the FIDE World Cup being held in Baku, Azerbaijan. Now, as we know, Magnus Carlsen, the five-time former world chess champion, has been on a great run from start to finish pretty much, but he's going up against a talented Indian junior, Ramesh Babu Pragg, who has been on a dream run, having defeated the former world number 2 player in the world, Hikaru, and the current number 2 player in the world, another American, Fabi in some great matches. So Pragg has been on the Cinderella run of the tournament. Can he keep it up against the former world chess champion and the number 1 player in the world, Magnus Carlsen? Let's jump right into the action. So here we go, game number 1, same format, 2 games of classical chess. If we're tied after the classical portion, we move to rapid and blitz tiebreaks. So Pragg has the white pieces in the first game, and he starts with the move c4, which is the classic English opening. We get pawn to e5 from Magnus, knight to c3, knight to f6, knight f3, knight c6, and g3. Now, all this is very standard. This is actually the same opening that I lost to Pragg in when I had the white pieces in our first tiebreak game of the 4th round match. I did a recap on that. You can obviously take a look at my comments about the specific bishop b4 line. So in this game, Magnus decides to play d5, and we essentially get a reverse Sicilian dragon. Now, one of the things with the English opening, very specifically, when you get c4 and e5, is it's essentially like playing the Sicilian, except with colors reversed. So normally the Sicilian goes with 1 e4 c5. Let's just say knight f3, knight c6, d4 takes, knight f6, knight c3, and g6. Now, one thing you'll notice about this position is that it's white's move here, whereas when we look at this position with the colors reversed, it's actually white's move here versus black's move. I know that sounds a little bit weird, but essentially white has 1 extra tempo since white is the player who makes the first move of the game. So we get the reverse Sicilian dragon or the open English opening. So here, after knight takes d5, we get bishop g2, and now Magnus plays this move knight to f6. Now, this is a move that, oddly enough, when I made my comeback to chess in 2021, I believe it was, there was a Grand Prix event that I played in Berlin, Germany, and it was, I believe, the second round of that event when I had the white pieces against Andrei Yesipenko from Russia. And before that game, I had been looking at a couple options. Now, in that game, Yesipenko played the classic bishop c5 variation, which Fabiano, Magnus, and others have played. But I did look briefly at this knight f6 move, and at the time, it looked a little bit odd. It wasn't something that a lot of top players were playing, but nonetheless, I didn't come up with anything concrete against it. Now, fast forward from 2021 to the year 2023, and grandmasters like Hikaru played it against Neil Dubov in one of the titled Tuesdays. Magnus Carlsen played against Wesley So, I believe, in the last Chess Champions Tour event. Peter Savitler also played this in the World Cup as well. So now knight f6 is in fashion, and this really speaks to one of the trends in chess, which is that due to the computers, all sorts of different opening possibilities are playable, even if we assume they're slightly dubious, because unless your opponent is perfect and they can play a precise game, they probably can't win. Even then, it's still probably only a draw if you know exactly what you're doing. So after knight to f6, Pragg plays the move b4 here, and that's a great idea from Pragg. It's very clear that going into this event, Pragg has done a lot of preparation on the English opening. I also forgot to mention that in this position, if we go back a couple of moves back to this position, I actually played knight d4 against him in the classical portion of our match as well. So it's very clear that Pragg is playing the English from white, from black. A lot of work that he did either before the tournament or throughout, so it's clearly paying dividends. So we get b4 here, and Magnus decides to play bishop d6. Now, at first glance, you probably think, well, wait, free pawn, why not just take? Now, if you were to take with a knight, white actually would take the pawn on e5, and white has more pawns in the center that he can push forward. So for that reason, white is a little bit better. And if you take with the bishop here, after knight takes e5, if you play knight takes knight, there's queen to a4 check, hitting the king and the bishop at the same time. If you block with the knight after bishop takes, pawn takes, and queen takes bishop, white is a little bit better here, even though he's given up this light square bishop around the king, because black's king cannot castle out of the center here, and for that reason, white should be significantly better. So Magnus plays bishop to d6, Pragg goes b5, and now we get this move knight to d4. Magnus tries to keep some control over the center. If you were to play knight to e7, after castles, white can potentially play a move like d4 here, and after pawn takes, knight takes, suddenly the diagonal is open. Black can't really develop the light square bishop very easily, because if you move it, you simply hang the pawn on b7, and for that reason, white once again has a big advantage. So Magnus plays knight to d4, Pragg plays queen a4, asking Magnus the question, what are you going to do with this knight on the d4 square? Magnus trades the knights, castles, Pragg castles, and now Magnus plays this move a6, trying to weaken the pawn on b5. Now, one thing that you'll notice in a lot of the pawn structures in the English opening is that white tries to push the pawns in tandem. So if we go back to very early on in the game, not specifically this position, but there are many variations of the English where white would play something like a3 or potentially something like b5 and down the road a4 to support the pawn chain so that black can never really create a weakness here. So when we fast forward to the game, the one problem for Pragg here is that without the pawn being able to go to a4, white will not be able to keep some grip here on this diagonal. Black can maybe play c6, maybe just open up the a file, and if we ever get a trade like pawn takes, rook takes, queen c2, black has a slightly better position because after c6 the pawns guard each other and this pawn on a2 is a little bit weak. Now again, not a big deal objectively, but nonetheless the pawn structure is preferable for black due to the 2 versus 1 on the queen side. So after a6, Pragg plays the move d3 here, logical move, trying to develop the bishop on this diagonal towards the g5 square. Now the computer actually likes this move rook to b1, which to me feels a little bit superficial. I know that for like a stockfish it might make sense, but after rook to b1 there's no actual threat here if black plays a move like queen to e7, because if you trade the pawns I just take back with the rook, and if you're not trading the pawns then what is the rook really doing on this b file exactly? If you ever go b6, I can always just go c6, develop the bishop to h3 or f5, and then bring the rooks to the center of the board very, very quickly, and black is actually quite a bit better here. So we get d3 from Pragg. Magnus plays h6, specifically designed to stop the bishop from pinning the knight on f6, but also creating the classic Lufthansa for the king on h7. For those of you who do speak German as a first language, obviously I'm making a meme, not to offend you guys, because of course the proper term would be Luft, not Lufthansa. But like any good American, we don't know these technical German words, but everybody does know about the greatest German airline in the world, Lufthansa. So we get h6. Pragg plays the move bishop a3 here, trying to develop the bishop on a different diagonal, because if you can't put the bishop on either g5 or f4, then a3 makes the most sense. So we get rook to b8 from Magnus, basically trying to break the pin on the diagonal, but also intending now to develop the light square bishop. Magnus would love to play a move like bishop to e6 here, but after bishop e6, white can simply gobble the pawn, and the bishop is really the last piece that black hasn't developed. When you look at the king, it's out of the center, knight's developed, bishop's developed. You really want to move the bishop and bring this rook to the center somewhere. So this is really the last issue that black has to resolve. If black can resolve this issue, black should be completely fine. So we get rook to b8 from Magnus. Pragg plays bishop takes bishop. Magnus takes back with the pawn, and already here the advantage is starting to slip away. Computer still thinks white is marginally better, but the pawn structure is clarifying a little bit. We now have some symmetrical pawns on the same files, and white's advantage is very, very minute, and I don't really think it's all that special. So now Pragg plays rook b1, trying to he's hoping that Magnus will trade the pawns on b5, and now maybe he can put pressure on the pawn on b7. Because if you look at that previous variation, just to go back for a second, when you get a position like, let's just say takes and c6, white can't really attack on this file. Black can guard the base of the chain very easily, which is the pawn on b7. So as long as you can guard the base of the chain with this pawn, white never has any ideas to attack on the b file. But here in the game, when we look at this position, after takes and queen takes b5, white now is trying to put pressure on this pawn, and a2 is actually not much of a weakness, whereas you'd love to put this pawn on d6 magically over here to stop the attacks on the diagonal. Nonetheless, black should be okay. So we get bishop to d7 from Magnus. Pragg goes queen to b6, and now Magnus plays this excellent move bishop to c6, basically trying to blunt the force of the bishop on f3, because in this position the only piece that white has that's really, really good is this unopposed bishop on the diagonal. But once Magnus goes bishop c6 here, now bishops are coming off the board and it's completely even. So Pragg spent some time. He ends up trading the queens here and trying to go into the endgame with bishop takes bishop, pawn takes, and now king g2. What Pragg is hoping for in this endgame is to be able to use this outside pass pawn. Meanwhile, black now has 6 connected pawns. All of black's pawns are connected, kind of like a snake, I guess you could say. Like they're all connected. You know, it's like 1 2 3 4 5 6. So black maybe has a very slightly better pawn structure. Now if black could magically get the king to the center here, for example, and build a big black center, black would be much better here with the pawns and the king and being able to use the A and the B files. But can black obtain that? So Magnus plays rook to a8 first, and the reason is he wants to stop this pawn from pushing up the board. Additionally, if white isn't careful, say you play a move like rook to d1, black can go rook to a3, you can no longer push the pawn, and now you have problems dealing with this knight and this pawn that both are under attack, and black is already quite a bit better. So Pragg goes rook b6 here, understanding that he has to be very quick here, because if black can get the rooks on the a file, get the king over the center, or maybe even build the big black center, it could go south in a hurry. So we get rook d to c8 from Magnus. Pragg plays rook c1, and now Magnus plays d5 here with the idea of playing d4 to remove the knight from the c3 square, where it is currently guarding the pawn on a2. So after d5, Pragg plays rook c2, guarding the pawn, anticipating that after d4 you can simply retreat the knight and now put pressure on the pawn on c6 as well. So Magnus goes knight to d7, Pragg plays the move rook to b1, and now Magnus goes knight c5 with a couple of ideas in mind. What Magnus wants to do is he'd love to put this knight on e6 here, where the knight can jump towards the d4 square potentially. He also would just love to slowly bring the king to the center of the board here, and if black can get a couple of these ideas in, it could be very good. Now, as we know, Magnus of course is the endgame maestro, so he really does like to play his endgames. I think Pragg, realizing that, he decides to make some very pragmatic decisions, pun unintended. I was about to say practical. I was trying to come up with a better pun, but I couldn't figure it out, so I said pragmatic. And he plays the move rook b to c1, and now Magnus plays the move rook to a5. Now Magnus is actually in a little bit of danger here. If you move the knight to e6, white can eat the pawn on d5, because if you capture, you simply lose the rook on c8, and after king h7 a4, the white pawn is simply rolling all the way up the board. Additionally, if you aren't careful and you play a move like rook b8, suddenly white can take anyway, and after pawn takes knight, rook takes knight, all of a sudden white is simply up an extra pawn here, and white will have excellent winning chances. So after rook b c1, Magnus plays rook to a5, protecting against the sacrifice, because after pawn takes knight, both of these rooks guard the knight on c5. Pragg goes knight to b1, and now Magnus plays knight to e6, and here Pragg plays the move knight to d2. Now on first glance, this looks like a very bad move, because you think, wait, black is knight d4, forking the rook and forking the pawn, but here white has the move knight to b3, attacking slash forking black's rook and black's knight. And after knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, white is actually a little bit better here, because a pawn on c6 is super weak, and if you play the move like rook b5, after takes rook b3, rook c5, suddenly white is going to get good winning chances, because black will lose one of these two pawns in the center of the board. So we get rook c to a8 from Magnus, taking no risks whatsoever. Pragg goes knight to f3, preventing knight d4, but also attacking the pawn on e5. Magnus plays e4, we get the pawn trade. Pragg goes back with knight d2, and now Magnus plays this move e3. Now Magnus could have tried to play knight d4 if he wanted to keep the game alive, but you do have to be very careful here, because after rook c4, knight takes e2, rook e1, it looks like black's knight is getting trapped here. You simply have no squares available without the knight being captured, but there's a fancy schmancy tactic here with the move rook to d5, attacking the knight. If white takes the knight, there's rook takes a2, and suddenly white can't guard either this knight on d2 or the rook on e2. At any rate, black is going to be better, probably still a draw, but black is the one who will have chances to win the game. But Magnus, sort of maybe sensing that, maybe not, decides, why do I want to go for any of that? Instead, he plays the move e3 here, sacrificing a pawn temporarily. Pragg ignores it by going knight c4, because after pawn takes pawn, rook takes a2. While this is still a draw, if anybody is better here, it's black, because you have a pawn that you can push, and white has these doubled pawns on e2 and e3. So Pragg goes knight c4, forking the rook, forking the pawn. Magnus plays rook takes a2, we get knight takes e3, and now the game is really petering out here, and it ends peacefully after knight to d4, rook takes rook, rook takes rook. Pragg goes rook c4, Magnus plays c5 here. He does not grab the pawn on e2, because even though this is still a draw, after a move like king f1, once again you're a little bit worried about the squares that are available for your knight. Now you can just go c5, chuck the pawn, and remove the knight, but why bother if you don't have to? So Magnus goes c5 right away. Pragg takes the pawn. Magnus captures with the rook here, and the players agree to a draw in this position due to the equal material on the board, all the pawns being on the same side. Probably one continuation that we would have seen if the game continued was rook c8, king h7, rook c7, king g8, rook c8, and the game could have ended with a repetition, or something like knight to f5, takes, and then something like this, where once again with only rooks and the same number of pawns on the board and on the same side more specifically, the game will end in a draw. So first game of the match ends in a draw. Tomorrow Magnus and Pragg will play game number 2. If it's a draw, they will move to tie breaks. If Magnus wins with the white pieces, he will of course win the event. Now, since this game was so short, we have an encore, which is we're going to take a look at the other game, the consolation match for the third / fourth place between Nijat Abasov, the local hero from Azerbaijan, who is on an absolute tear in this turn. Also a player having a Cinderella run, even more unexpected than Pragg, I would say. But he's been on a great run. He lost to Magnus last round, put up a great fight, but today he's playing against the current number 2, the American Fabiano Caruana. So in game number 1, Abasov has the white pieces, and he starts with d4. Fabiano plays knight to f6. We get knight to f3 here. Fabi goes d5, and now we get c4. Abasov does not play the London system. Now, Abasov did play the London system against both Magnus as well as FIDE Gujarati, who he beat in the previous round. Of course, Fabiano himself yesterday in the tie breaks against Pragg faced the London system. So today, Abasov decides to play something different. So we get c4, e6, g3. Fabiano plays bishop e7. Bishop g2, castles, dc4, and now we've reached the classic Catalan opening from white, and the game continues with queen c2. Fabi plays a6, and now Abasov goes a4. Now, white can take this pawn on c4. In fact, this was featured in the World Chess Championship match, I believe in 1985 or 1986, between Garry Kasparov, also known as Gary Chess, and Anatoly Karpov. So the Catalan opening has been around for many, many years. It's been very prominent at the top level. Kasparov, Karpov, Kramnik, Carlsen, all the top players have played it. Now in this game, Abasov plays a5 to stop the easy development with b5 and bishop b7, fianchettoing the bishop. So after a4, we get bishop d7, queen c4, bishop c6, bishop g5, knight bd7. It's worth pointing out that, of course, Pragg also did play the Catalan against Fabiano in their classical match as well. Now, all this very standard so far. We get knight c3, h6 here. Now, what you'll notice in this position is that black actually has, in a way, fianchettoed the bishop on c6, but you aren't able to gain space with this b5 pawn thrust. So after h6, we get bishop f4, bishop to d6, and now Abasov plays this move queen d3, intending to play for e4 and creating the big white center here, if possible. Now here, Fabiano decides to trade the bishops, and you're probably thinking, ew, white has these double pawns. This can't be very good for white. But the one thing with doubled pawns is in some cases when you get doubled pawns, there is an advantage. In this case, it opens up the G file here. So after G takes f4, we get a5, king to h1 played by Abasov, and Abasov is a very simple plan. He wants to go rook g1, use this open g file, and the pawn on f4 is actually not a weakness because down the road, let's just play a random move like rook b8. After e3, rook a8, rook g1, the pawns are actually very nice here. They all guard each other. We have some kind of weird I don't know, it's like triangle or what, I can't think of the formation, but we have some kind of formation where the pawns are very good, and in return for these stacked pawns, you have this open g file that you can use. So we get bishop takes f3 from Fabi, bishop takes bishop, Fabi goes c6, trying to blunt the threats on the diagonal from this bishop on f3. Now here, Abasov goes rook g1, we get king to h8, and now he plays e4, being very, very aggressive here, trying to push for e5, maybe f5, maybe also d5, but white has a massive control with the pawns, and these knights are really not very active here for black. They're very restricted. You don't really have squares available in the center of the board, so for that reason, it's a very dangerous position already. Now, I don't know if Fabiano was maybe out of prep or maybe just like a little bit tilted, just tired, sheer exhaustion from yesterday's match, but it really feels like he's struggling. So he plays queen to e7. We get rook g3 from Abasov, intending to create the classic Wendy's double stack with rook a g1. We get rook a d8, rook to g1. Fabi plays rook to g8, trying to guard the pawn on g7, and now Abasov plays this move e5 here. An excellent move as well, because if black tries to go knight to d5, after bishop takes knight, pawn takes a knight to b5, suddenly the knight is jumping to d6. There will be a bastion. You have a lot of problems on g file. White can also push f5 to open up the f file, and it's really, really scary to play. So here, Fabiano instead plays knight to h7, and now Abasov goes queen to e3. Now, computer actually thinks that white should play knight e4 and knight d6 anyway to create the bastion and a classic connect 5 as well, I just noticed, but we aren't computers at the end of the day. We are human. So we get queen to e3. Fabiano plays knight b6, trying to jump with the knight to either the c4 d5 square. Abasov plays bishop e4, trying to use his great bishop on the long diagonal to always spy the knight on h7. Now, this actually is a mistake here. The computer thinks that knight e4 once again is the best move, because after bishop to e4, black can play this move f5 here, trying to take away the threats on the diagonal. And if white plays pawn takes pawn, for example, in this position, after knight takes pawn, suddenly black has these great knights that jump to the center immediately. You don't have the grip because you no longer have the e-pawn, and suddenly the pawns on f4 and f2 are very weak. d4 is also weak, and black actually is probably better here. But Fabiano instead plays this move queen to b4 after a long thing. Now, I don't know what was going on with Fabiano, because if the clocks are to be believed, he spent 23 minutes on this move, and this move simply loses the game on the spot. This is a huge mistake from Fabiano. I don't know, probably there'll be an interview with him, which I haven't seen yet, but queen b4 simply loses the game on the spot, because after bishop takes knight, king takes bishop, and knight to e4, suddenly the g file plays. There's knight to f6, and there's also knight to g5. So on first glance, you'd probably think, well, first of all, black can just play queen takes d4. But the problem with queen takes d4 is white has knight to g5 checking the king. If you go forward, I can just fossilize you with knight takes e6, and you lose your queen. And if you go pawn takes knight, it's checkmate in 2 after rook h3, king g6, and rook takes g5. King has no squares available. And the last line is king to h8, and after takes, king h7, queen to b3 here, attacking the knight. Black has a lot of problems. If you try to move the knight, or if you try to move the rook to say f8 after queen c2, you're getting mated on this long diagonal here. White is simply crashing through, and you will lose in a few moves. And if you play the obvious move queen to d5, checking the king and trying to trade the queens, after queen takes queen, rook takes queen, white has another unbelievable move, knight takes h6, sacking the knight here. If you take with the king, it's a classic ladder checkmate. King has no squares to go to. If you take with the pawn, you lose the tower, and then we have castle mania on the g file. And if you play a move like rook to, I don't know, f8, for example, white can simply take the pawn, and after king takes h6, there's rook to g6, king h7, rook to g3, and the ladder is once again simply unstoppable. If you go rook f6, I take the rook and win the game, and there's no other way to stop rook h3 checkmating the king. And if you go king h5, I check with the other rook, and after king h4, there's rook to h6, which is also checkmate, a standard ladder technique that you will see very oftentimes at the beginner level. So after knight to e4, if you can't play queen takes d4, then what else can you really do? So Fabiano tries to play queen e7 so that if white goes knight g5 here, you can just slide the king back, and now the queen is guarding the pawn on f7. But after Abasov plays this move f5 here, Fabiano tips his king and resigns the game, because checkmates are basically unstoppable here. If you take the pawn on f5, white can play knight to f6 check, and after g takes f6, you sack the queen, king takes queen, and rook h3 is an absolutely beautiful checkmate. And if you play king to h8, then we get the classic Arabian checkmate by sacking the queen. Takes, rook g8, boom, GG, why not? King is stuck in the corner pocket, and that's all she wrote. So you can't take the pawn on f5, and if you play a move like knight to d5 trying to attack the queen, there probably are many ways to win, but the cleanest is to sack the rook with rook takes g7, rook takes rook, rook takes rook, king takes rook, and then f6 check, forking the king and the queen. If you move the king to say h7, I simply take your queen, you take my queen, I take your rook, get a new queen, and it's over, completely hopeless. White has an extra queen on the board. And if you go king to f8, I take the queen with check, and then I just move the queen away, and once again, at the top level, zero chance of a comeback. So Fabiano resigns this game here after f5, a sort of very anticlimactic game on many levels. My read of this game is that Fabiano probably just sheer exhaustion, completely tired, all the nerves are gone, just has nothing left in the tank, falls apart and loses a very tough game. What I would say on the other hand is it does show that Abasov is very well prepared, that he is not some one-trick pony. He is going to be a force to be reckoned with. Now, I still think that probably compared to the other top players, they have better preparation. They'll get adjusted and used to what he's going to play in the candidates. But nonetheless, he is showing that he's no joke and he is here to stay. So a very, very nice win for Abasov. Tomorrow, they will also play the second classical game. Fabiano will have the white pieces. He will try to win that game and force tie breaks, but it's going to be difficult at any rate. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap of both the grand finals of the FIDE World Cup being held in Baku, Azerbaijan, as well as the consolation game between Abasov and Fabiano. So I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Hopefully game 2 tomorrow will be more interesting between Magnus and Pragg. But at any rate, you never know what's going to happen, which is why we turn up every day. We watch these great games of chess between these legends, and we see what happens, and we do our recap. So I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below if you haven't already, and I'll be back tomorrow with another great recap for YouTube. See you guys. Bye.